Hello everyone, Phoenix Knight here. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a new playthrough on the channel. After our visit to the Harry Potter universe last week, we're back to another familiar universe this week as we play Aeon's End from indie boards and cards. In this game, we're breach mages defending Gravehold from the Nameless. Like Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle, this is another deck builder. Very different with the breaches being a real concern in this game, and that's how we prepare our spells. Everything that should make more sense when we get into the game. With that, though, we've got our mages all set up, so let's go meet them now. If you're a regular viewer on the channel, you probably know that our breach magi that we're taking out tonight. These are two custom mages that I built in a previous playthrough of Aeon's End Legacy, and I really like that customizable environment of Legacy where you're able to build your magi. First up, we've got Celidia, who's very much a supporty, healy-ish kind of mage. Her special abilities are she's got Vengeful Shadows. Whenever she casts 2 or more spells during the casting phase, gain an ether. Power Word Silence, once per turn during her main phase, I can discard a card in hand. If I do, silence a minion. Then her special ability for 6 charges is Will of the High Priestess. Gain a spell from any supply pile. You may place that spell into any ally's hand, and any ally gains 2 charges. We'll need to spend 2 ether to get each of her charges. And there's her configuration of breaches. 1 starts open. She'll be player 1, by the way. 2 and 3 both start with the open spot to the left, and 4 starts off at the bottom. We're, of course, rotating through until they get to the top. So that's how all of those work out. With that, let's move over to her partner. Celidia's partner tonight was also her partner during that playthrough of Aeon's End Legacy. I'm, of course, talking about Nyrissia, who is much more offensive-minded. Her special abilities, she's got Dark Blessing. Once per turn during your main phase, you may discard a card in hand. If you do, deal 1 damage. Then we've got Rage of the Sith. Once per turn, when you focus or open a breach, deal 2 damage. And her special ability, also for 6 charges, is Netherlord's Wrath. Cast any player's prepped spell without discarding it. That spell deals 1 additional damage. And any player returns a spell in their discard pile to their hand. Nyrissia is player 2 tonight, and she's got the same breach configuration as Celidia does. We'll probably be leaning on that ping damage in tonight's game. So let's go meet our adversary to see why. Tonight we're taking on a nemesis known as the Spawning Horror. So let's pull the Spawning Horror's board up so we can take a look. 50 health, which the life dial over here, once it decides to focus, we'll see that it's all set to 50 life. I'll adjust that just slightly so it's a bit easier to see. There we go. Okay, back to the Spawning Horror. When Unleash comes up, the Breeding Chamber gains 3 life, and that'll be relevant when we get into the additional rules. At the end of the Nemesis turn, if Breeding Chamber has 11 or more life, it imbues a pod. Draw a card from the pod deck, place it into play, and Breeding Chamber loses 10 life. Repeat this until Breeding Chamber has 10 or less life. When a pod is discarded, place it in the pod discard pile. This is not the same as the Nemesis discard pile. When the pod deck is empty, shuffle the pod discard pile to form a new pod deck. When there are 7 pods in play, Spawning Horror completes its metamorphosis and the players lose. There's also increased difficulty there. You can pause that to read if you want, but we're not playing with that. I've got another dial up here. First time we're using one of these dials on the channel. These are the Gamegenic dials, the Gamegenic life counter dials. They are actually very handy for board gaming as well. We've got that set to 4 life already. Minion can never have less than 1 life, no maximum life. So we'll need to keep that under control if we can. But let's go take a look at our market for tonight. Here's our market for tonight. As always, the configuration is 3 gems, 2 relics, 4 spells. Looking at the gems first, we've got the Voidium Spike for 3 ether. Gain 2 ether. And each ally may discard a card in hand. Each ally that does gain 1 charge. That could actually be really good. Then we've got the Mentite Chunk for 5 ether. gain 3 ether. If there are 7 or more cards in your discard pile, gain an additional 1. And then the Alien Element for 4. Gain 1 ether for each of your breaches with a spell prepped to it, gain an additional 1. The market's a little bit more expensive, I think, than I'm used to, but we'll see how that works out. Next up, we'll look at the relics. We've got Void Mill. Focus any player's breach. 2 different players may destroy the top card of their discard pile. So if we need to get some junk out of there, we can do that with this. And then we've got a Reflective Conduit for 3. Attached to any player's breach. When a spell is cast from this breach, the player who cast that spell may return it to their hand instead of discarding it. If they do, discard this. Then we get some very expensive spells, so we'll probably need the gems a little bit more than usual tonight. We've got a Scorch at 5 ether. Deal 4 damage. If this causes a minion from the Nemesis deck to be discarded, an ally gains 2 charges. So presumably that wouldn't trigger if we use that to get rid of a pod against the spawning horror. At least that's how I'm going to play that. Next up, we've got Gravity Node, which costs 5. Any player discards a card in hand. If they do, deal 4 damage. Then we've got 2 6s. Snap Ritual first up. While prepped once per turn during your main phase, you may discard a card in hand to deal 2 damage. Cast to deal 3. So we'd have to sit with the turn with that being prepped. And then we've got a Chaos Arc for 6. Cast, deal 3 damage, and deal 2 additional damage for each prepped spell in an adjacent breach. We'll go through the flavor texts when those actually come up. But with that all set up, I think we're all set to move back up top to check our final shot. We also have our Gravehold dial, of course, all set at 30 life. With that, though, looking at the final shot, I think we're all set to get into this game. So let's drop in and get started into our first turn. For those of you who aren't familiar with how Aeon's End works, we've actually got a turn order deck that we're going to use to determine turn order. The deck's built with 1 card per player in the deck, except if you're playing with 2 players, you have 2 for each player. So if you're playing solo, you have 4, and then there are 2 Nemesis cards in the deck as well. So we'll shuffle this up once per time through the deck, and then we'll draw a card from this to determine who's going in the turn order. We'll walk through the first round slowly, and then we'll start letting everything flow a little bit more. So we'll shuffle that, give it a cut, and here's our first turn. So our first turn is going to take us to the Nemesis. So let's move up to the spawning horror. On a Nemesis turn, you would start off by resolving all of the cards in the Nemesis deck, starting in the Nemesis play area, starting from the oldest to the newest. But since this is the first turn of the game, we have nothing going on here. So our first card from the Nemesis, Amplify Energy. To discard, we have to spend 6 ether. On a power, resolve the persistent effect of the pod with the most life 3 times, or Breeding Chamber gains 5 life. So with a power like that, we get 3 power tokens. Actually, we'll use a die for that. That'll be a lot easier to do. So we'll put a die on that rather than having a bunch of tokens floating around. So we've got a 3 there for taking 3 Nemesis turns to go off. Our next card out of the turn order deck. That's it for the turn, by the way. Player 2. So now let's drop down to Nyrissia. I'm just going to move I just moved the health dials for both players out of the way. On a player turn, you start off with the casting phase, where you can cast any of your prepped spells in your opened breaches, but you have to cast anything prepped to a closed breach. And you can place cast spells on top of your discard pile as you cast them. So now we're into the main phase, which means we can play a gem or relic card, gain a card, a charge, focus or open a breach, and just to explain how that's different, we can either pay the cost on top to open the breach outright, or pay a cost on the inside to focus the breach, which will rotate it 1 from being opened. We can prep a spell to a breach. We can prep to a closed. We can prep to a closed breach if we focused it that turn, or we can always prep to an opened breach. Then we can resolve any while prepped or to discard effects. So with that in mind, I think I'm going to start off by spending 2 ether to focus Nyrissia's 2 breach. And I'm going to deal 2 damage because of her Rage of the Sith to the breeding chamber, which will bring that down. Come on. Once it focuses, that'll bring that down to 2. The reason I'm doing that is because I know the power effect is very likely to go off. So I want to make sure that thing's already down on life a bit. Then I'm going to discard a 3rd crystal to do a little bit of ping damage to the spawning horror to bring it down to 49. The only way I think we're getting the 6 ether for that is by a miracle. But I'll prepare a Nyrissia's Fury, which we'll take a look at that when we actually cast it, and a Spark to her 2 breach. Again, we focused the 2 breach, so we're able to cast that. We'll move everything to the discard pile. Then the draw phase, we can manipulate the order of the discard pile. So we'll just check out Nyrissia's hand there. Okay, cool. And then that's the end of a player turn. Any questions on that, feel free to put them in the comments section down below. But we're going to get things rocking and rolling here. I think we're going to start turning on the jets a little bit here. Let's see what our next turn is. Player 1, so let's move over to Celidia. Still with no minions to discard, I think we're going to do something a little bit different for Celidia. We're going to gain 3 ether. I'm going to prep Celidia's Spark to her 1 breach. I'm actually going to use that to open her 2 breach, the 3 ether to open her 2 breach outright, so I can prep a Spark to it. Then we'll discard all of that, draw back up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, cool. And that's it for Celidia's turn. Next out of the turn order deck we find Player 1. Good thing we're right here with Celidia. So we'll start off with a Spark to hit the spawning horror for 1, down to 48. Then she's going to cast Celidia's Spark as well to deal 1 damage, and if her discard pile contains 4 or more other cards, which it does, deal 2 additional damage. So that'll be another 3 to the spawning horror, which will bring it down to 45. Then we'll prepare 2 Sparks to her 1 and 2 breach, and we've got 3 to buy with. And I think 3 to buy with is going to get us, it's going to get us a Voidium Spike. I'll stack it like that. Now when your discard pile, when your deck's out and you need to draw, you don't actually shuffle your deck like you do in most deck builders. In this one, you're just going to take your discard pile, which is over here, and effectively flip it straight over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you're basically drawing from the bottom of your discard pile. This is where you're manipulating the discard order will come into play. Next up for the turn order deck, we'll have the Nemesis. So we'll move back up to the spawning horror. Now we'll get to start seeing a little better idea of how the Nemesis turn works. So now we're going to tick Amplify Energy down to 2, and we'll draw a new card from the Nemesis deck. We'll find Unearth. If there are no pods in play, Breeding Chamber gains 5 life. Otherwise, Gravehold suffers 4 damage. There are no pods in play, so the Breeding Chamber will gain 5 life, which will bring it up to 7. And now we need to keep an eye on getting the chamber under control. We haven't had any unleashes yet, so I'm not too worried about that. But I want to make sure that Amplify Energy isn't going to just trigger the spawning horror to start spawning pods on us. Check at the end of the Nemesis turn. The Breeding Chamber does not have 11 or more life on it, so it's not going to imbue a pod. And by watching everything in the turn order deck, we know that this card is a player 2 turn. So let's move down to Nyrissia. That 5 life from that Unearth was a very unwelcome surprise. Let's see what Nyrissia can do about that now. She's going to Spark. She has to cast the Spark that's prepped to her 2 breach. She'll hit the Breeding Chamber with that to bring it down to 6. The other way, down to 6. Then she's going to use her Nyrissia's Fury, which on cast deal 1 damage, and we can point that anywhere. Gain 1 ether that can only be used to gain a spell, but I don't think we're going to be gaining any spells with it. And we gain a charge. That'll be 1 of 6 for Nyrissia's special ability. I think we'll point the damage at the breeding horror, at the breeding chamber. Bring that down. We'll bring that down to 5. And unless I'm crazy, and I'm not, we have 3 ether, 4 if we want to cast a spell with it, or if we want to gain a spell with it, but we can't. What do we want to do with that, though? Well, I'm going to prep the Spark to her 1 breach. I think we're going to use the 3 ether to gain a Voidium Spike as well with that. Then we'll discard the extra Spark to deal 2 more damage to the breeding chamber. Since I know that's going to go off this turn. Since I know that's going to go off on this next run through the turn order deck, I want to keep the breeding chamber's life somewhat in check. So we use the three ether from there to get the Voidium Spike. Again, we couldn't get a spell because all our spells cost 5. Nyrissia is also out of cards. 3, 4, 5. Okay. With that, we're through a run of the Nemesis of the turn order deck. So let's move back up top to look at how the board state's changed. Life is so far unchanged for both Celidia and Nyrissia. Neither one of them's taken any damage. Celidia's 2 breaches opened. Nyrissia's is focused, ready to be opened. We're probably going to try to open that next turn. As for the spawning horror, it's down to 45. Amplify Energy is going to go off on our next run through the turn order deck. And the breeding chamber is down to 3 life. So unless we get a surprise unleash, we shouldn't get any pods imbued on us. But we need to get the turn order deck together for another run through it. So this is the start of round 2. We'll give this a shuffle. And a cut. Put that there. And our first card in the turn order deck this time is the Nemesis once again. So let's move up to the spawning horror. Amplify Energy ticks down. And then we'll draw a card from the Nemesis deck we'll find. Daze. Any player suffers 2 damage and discards a card in hand. If that card costs 0, Gravehold suffers 2 damage. The question is, who's going to suffer the 2 damage? I think... And it's all going to be zeros. I think there's zeros for everybody right now. Yes, they are. I think Nyrissia is going to discard her Spark. Is going to suffer the 2 damage and discard a Spark, which will bring her down to 8. And Gravehold to 28. And that's it for the Nemesis turn. Next up we have player 2. So let's move down to Nyrissia. Just to guard against the surprise unleash causing the breeding chamber to spawn something, I'm going to point this Spark at the breeding chamber to bring it down to 2. This way, by hitting the breeding chamber with that Spark, an unleash will only bring it up to 5, and then the Amplify Energy, when that goes off, will bring it up to 10, which still won't be enough to cause the spawning horror to imbue a pod. Will cause the breeding chamber to imbue a pod. Then, with that in mind, I've got 3 to buy with, and a Nyrissia's Fury, which the Nyrissia's Fury I'm going to prep to her 2 breach, or to her 1 breach. Then what do I want to do with that 3 ether? I could focus her 3 breach, or I could go get another Voidium Spike. I think we're actually going to open her 2 breach outright. So we're going to open her 2 breach. And then because we focused, we'll hit the boss with that for 2. To bring the boss down to 43. And then since we only needed 2, we'll end up discarding one of the crystals to bring the breeding chamber. Actually, Let's hit the boss with that. The breeding chamber right now being at 2 health is actually fine right now, so I'm not too worried about that. That's it for Nyrissia's turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we can probably get some good stuff there. Our next card up for the turn order deck is the Nemesis, so we're back up to the spawning horror. Amplify energy will go off, which means the breeding chamber will gain 5 life, bringing it up to 7. That's why I was trying to keep the life of the... other way, going up to 7. That's why I was trying to keep the... That's why I'm trying to keep the health in check there. Next card from the Nemesis deck we find... Ether Extract. Power to Unleash. Any player may discards 2 gems. If both of those gems cost 0 ether, unleash. There's no way we can stop that from going off. The only thing we can do right now is keep the breeding chamber under control. The only good thing about having the Nemesis go 2 times in the first 3 cards is all 3 cards remaining now are player cards, which means now I want to try to get the breeding chamber back under 3 health. It's going to unleash twice most likely, so if I can get it back down to about... If I can get it back down to 3 health, that should be fine. We've basically got free reign to get that thing down before the next round starts. Next up, player 1. So let's move down to Celidia. 2 sparks, I think we'll hit the breeding chamber for 2. We'll bring that down to 5. Start working on bringing that down so a double unleash won't cause us problems. Other way. Down to 5. Okay, then we'll prep a Celidia's Spark to her 1, a regular Spark to her 2, and we've got 3 Ether to buy with, which I think will be another Voidium Spike. I'm having to focus a little bit more on Ether this game, since the market is a little bit more expensive than I'm used to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll see we've got an Ether-heavy turn coming up next turn. Let's see what our next card in the turn order deck is. We have... Player 1. Good thing we're right here with Celidia. So the Celidia's Spark will hit the breeding chamber for 1 to bring it down to... Actually, we'll hit it with both Sparks. So we'll hit it for 2 to bring it down to 3. That way, once again, the double unleash won't cause... At least initially won't cause problems. Let's see. And we've got 1 Ether... We'll prep a Spark to her 1, 3, 4, 5, 6 Ether to buy with, and any ally on the Voidium Spike may discard a card in hand. Each ally that does gains a charge. I think Nyrissia will... Well, looking at her hand right now, we can actually discard a crystal, because she'll still be at 5 Ether, which will be enough to get a... spell, because she's got the Nyrissia's Fury ready to go as well. For 6, I think Celidia will grab a... I think Celidia will grab a Scorch for 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then we know what the last card in the turn order deck is, but just so you guys know everything's on the up and up, we'll see that as a player 2, so let's move over to Nyrissia. Nyrissia's Fury is going to deal a damage to the breeding chamber, just to keep that under control, which will bring the breeding chamber down to 2. Nyrissia will get a charge, and she'll have an Ether that she can only use to get a spell, but I think we are probably buying a spell this turn. The Voidium Spike, 2 crystals, and we'll prep a Spark to her 1 breach. Celidia now has the option to discard a card for a charge, but I don't think I think she will, actually. She'll discard a crystal to gain a charge. Okay, Nyrissia's now got 5. She's got 4 Ether to play with. 5 if she's gaining a spell. 4 Ether to play with. 5 if she's getting a spell. I I think she is getting a spell this turn. I think she's going to grab a... Is she going to grab a Scorch or is she going to grab a Gravity Node? I think she's going to grab a... Actually, she could grab a... No, I think I want to grab a spell this turn, and I think I'm going to grab a Scorch. I want to start turning up the heat rather literally on our adversaries, or on the spawning horror. 2, 3, 4, 5. That moves over. That's not a particularly interesting hand, but let's move back up top to look at how the board state's changed. Both 2 breaches are open at this point, and both of them have sparks prepped to their 1 breaches. Nyrissia is at 8, Celidia is at 10 health. Looking up at the spawning horror, we've got an ether extract sitting on 2 power, the spawning horror is at 42, and the breeding chamber is at 2 health. So not too much going on right now, but let's grab the turn order deck once again, give it a shuffle to start round 3. Hopefully we won't have the Nemesis going right away. And hopefully we can get a turn in there hopefully we can get a couple turns in there if we need to keep the breeding chamber under control. But let's see what our first card is. 3rd round in a row that the Nemesis has gone first in every round of this game so far. So let's move up to the spawning horror. Ether extract is ticking down toward going off, and our next card. Ambush. Unleash. Gravehold suffers 2 damage. Any player suffers 1 damage. Alright, so Unleash means the spawning horror gains 3 life. Bringing it up to 5. So now we definitely need to keep an eye on that double Unleash. That'll cause a pod to go off. That'll cause a pod to go off at the end of the next Nemesis turn. So we probably want to get that down rather quickly. Celidia this time will suffer the 1 damage, and then Gravehold will suffer another 2. If this next card's a Nyrissia turn, we can probably bring the breeding chamber back down before ether extract goes off. It's a Celidia turn, which we can probably still do something with that, but let's move down to Celidia. We'll hit the breeding chamber with the spark to bring it down to 4. That way, a double Unleash from the ether extract won't just trigger the breeding chamber. Then we'll prep a spark to our 1 breach, and we've got 4 to buy with an option for Nyrissia to discard a card to gain a charge, which I don't think she'll do. I think she'll pass on that this time. Then with 4 ether, Celidia will grab an alien. Yeah, I think it'll be an alien element. Move everything to the discard pile. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we've got some serious firepower coming up, but let's see what the turn order deck says is going to happen. The turn order deck says player 2, so let's move over to Nyrissia. We'll start off by sparking the breeding chamber back down to 3. That's about where I want to keep it, so I can keep the breeding chamber under control. Then we're going to prep 2 sparks to her open breaches, and then we've got 3 ether to buy with, which I think is going to be focusing her 3 breach. Then we'll hit the boss with the 2 damage from Rage of the Sith. So that'll bring the spawning horror down to 40. And we'll discard all of this and draw back up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's interesting. Next card from the turn order deck. Player 1, so we're back over to Celidia. I definitely want to start pointing more damage at the boss, so we're going to spark the spawning horror for 1 to bring it down to 39. As long as we don't get a surprise unleash out of the turn order, out of the Nemesis deck, the breeding chamber shouldn't be causing us any problems this round. So, with that in mind, I'm going to play out the Voidium Spike and the Crystal. Nyrissia can discard a card in hand for a charge, and I think she... will not. Nyrissia is going to pass on that. Celidia, with that in mind, will focus her 3 breach as well. Then she's going to prep a Scorch to her 1 breach, a Spark to her 2, and Celidia's Spark to her focused 3. That's it for Celidia's turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That could be interesting. But let's see what's next in the turn order deck. Next up we find the Nemesis. So let's move back up to the Spawning Horror. Now we have an interesting decision to make, because Ether Extract is going to be going off, which means we have our first Unleash. So the Spawning Horror will gain 3 life, other gain Phoenix, and then any player discards 2 gems. If both of them cost 0, Unleash. I don't want Nyrissia to spend gems, because the next card in the turn order deck is her turn. Celidia, however, now has a 4-cost gem that she could discard to stop the second Unleash. And by the time it gets back to her turn, I think all these spells are going to be cast. So she will discard a Crystal and the Alien Element. And since the Alien Element costs 4, the second Unleash doesn't happen, and the Breeding Chamber doesn't imbue a pod, so we get lucky there. Next card up from the Nemesis deck. Construct. Draw a card from the pod deck and place it into play. Then set that minion's life to 2. This does not affect shield tokens. Pod up next. A Crystalline Pod with 7, actually we set it to 2. Persistent, any player discards a card in hand. So fortunately for us, that Persistent won't be going off before Nyrissia's turn. In fact, we can probably blast that thing down on Nyrissia's next turn. But just to remove any suspense, it's a player 2 turn. So let's move down to Nyrissia. Looking at Nyrissia's turn, the 2 Sparks are going to take care of that Crystalline Pod, because I'd rather not be discarding cards in hand. I've got enough stuff that's going to be enough cards that are going to be making me discard. I don't want to pour gasoline on that fire. We'll start off with a Nyrissia's Fury to her 1, a Scorch to her... Actually, you know what? We're going to hold off on that for the time being, because I'm going to start off with 3 Ether for the Voidium Spike and the Crystal. Celidia will... Celidia will discard a Crystal in hand to gain a charge to the Voidium Spike. And then the 3 Ether from there is going to open Nyrissia's 3 Breach, which gives us a +1 damage on cast. We'll point the 2 damage from Rage of the Sith at the Spawning Horror to bring it down to 37. Then we'll prep the Scorch to the aforementioned 3 Breach that we just opened. And the Crystal, I think we'll discard that to Dark Blessing to deal 1 damage to the Crystalline Pod. I want to try to keep the... That's a little bit high for comfort, especially with enough cards now that we're getting into... potentially getting into... Actually, I think we're going to be in level 2 after this. I want to try to keep the Breeding Chamber under control. So, just in case we get any kind of double Unleash. Which I'd obviously rather not have happen, but is a thing that can. Especially as we saw Ether Extract earlier in the game have a conditional double Unleash, but we managed to avoid that. Anyway, we're through the Nemesis, we're through the turn order deck once again, so let's move back up top and look at how the board state's changed. With Nyrissia's 3 Breach open, and Celidia's 3 Breach about to be opened, we're getting ready to turn the heat up on the Spawning Horror. We've kept the Breeding Chamber, as we tip up to the Spawning Horror, we've kept the Breeding Chamber nicely under control this game. Right now, it's at 5 health. The Spawning Horror is at 37. Celidia is at 9 health. Nyrissia is at 8. And we've got a lot of firepower coming in the breaches. Let's give the turn order deck another shuffle and see where we're starting. Can we please have the Nemesis... Can we please not have the Spawning Horror go first this round? That would be great. Okay, thanks. Let's see what's happening here. I said I didn't want the Nemesis to go first, but that's where we're stuck, so let's move up to the Spawning Horror. We are just vulnerable to a double unleash now, so I do need to keep that in mind. First card up from the Nemesis deck. Retribution. If there are no pods in play, Breeding Chamber gains 8 life. Otherwise, any player suffers 4 damage. Well, now we are... The Breeding Chamber will gain 8 life because we've kept the pods under control. We only had 1 spawn. This one's going to be at full strength, though. So we are at the end of the turn, the Nemesis turn, so we're getting a pod. The pod we're getting is an acidic pod. Persistent. The player with the fewest opened breaches suffers 2 damage. We'll need to take care of that in a hurry. At least the breeding chamber will lose 10 life. Next up from the turn order deck we'll find player 2. So let's drop down to Nyrissia. Bit of a weird situation here. So I've got enough damage prepped right now for Nyrissia to defeat the acidic pod outright. What I'm not sure about though is if the Scorch would give me the 2 charges from the damage causing it to be discarded. I'm going to rule, for the purposes of the video, I'm going to rule no, it doesn't, but I'll either add an editing note or pin a comment to the video down below, depending on when I hear back. So Nyrissia's Fury will start off by hitting the acidic pod for 1, which will give me a charge, and I can gain an ether that I can only use to gain a spell. Then the Scorch will defeat the aforementioned acidic pod with the 5 damage. So that'll get discarded, and then because of how I'm playing the spell for the video, I won't get the charges from Scorch. So with that, I'll prep a Spark to Nyrissia's 1 breach, and then use her 4 ether to focus her 4 breach, which Rage of the Sith will then trigger and hit the Spawning Horror for 2 damage. I just want to make sure that acidic pod isn't going to cause me a lot of problems. So we'll move that over to the discard pile. 3, 4, 5. Okay. Got some firepower coming. Let's see what's next in the turn order deck. We'll find the Nemesis. So we're right back up to the Spawning Horror. Nothing going on right now with the Spawning Horror, so we just pull a card from the Nemesis deck. We find Dispel, unleash twice. The player with the most prepped spells discards their most expensive prepped spell. Ouch. So unleashing twice means the Spawning Horror will gain 6 life, going up to 9, which thankfully isn't enough to trigger the end of turn. Where that'll hurt us more is in losing Celidia her Scorch. That's rather unfortunate, but nothing we can do about that. Fortunately, though, we're out of Nemesis cards in the turn order deck, so we should have pretty much free reign to do whatever we need to, whether it's knocking the Breeding Chamber down a little bit or potentially pointing some damage at the Spawning Horror. Let's see what we draw here. We draw player 1, so let's drop down to Celidia. Fortunately, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7... The one good thing, actually that wouldn't have been a good thing anyway, Celidia's Spark will trigger hitting the... where do we want to point this? Do we want to point this at the Breeding Chamber or the boss? I think we're going to point this 3 damage at the Breeding Chamber. We'll bring that down to 6. Then we'll point a regular Spark at the Breeding Chamber as well, to bring it down to 5. That way it's going to take a double unleash to imbue another pod. Then we'll prep a Spark to her 2 breach, and we've got a crystal, so we'll draw up to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll see we've got a little bit of firepower coming. Each of our players have a card left, so first up we'll find player 2, so we're going to move back over to Nyrissia. We're going to spark the Spawning Horror for 2 to bring it down to 33. We'll probably be doing a little bit of ping damage to the breeding chamber this turn as well, trying to continue keeping that under control. We'll prep sparks to her 3 and 2 breaches. Then we've got 4 ether to buy with. Celidia can discard a card for a charge, and she will not. I don't think. No, she won't. All right, 4 ether. We'll get Nyrissia. We'll actually focus Nyrissia's 4 breach, which will hit the breeding chamber for another 2 with that to bring it down to 3. We'll keep that under control and keep ourselves out of danger from a double unleash. Especially now that we're deeper into the Nemesis deck. I want to try to keep that in as much check as I can. And from the turn order deck, we'll see... Hey, look at that. We got a player 1, so let's move over to Celidia. With the coast being very much clear, we definitely need to start pointing more damage at the boss. So I'm going to spark the Spawning Horror for 1 damage to bring it down to 32. We're keeping the breeding chamber under control very nicely. We're going to start off with a Voidium Spike. Nyrissia can discard a card in hand to gain a charge. This would be her 5th charge, and she'll discard a crystal to get her 5th charge. Then we're going to gain 3 more ether, and we'll prep a spark to her 2 breach. With 5, I think that's going to be another Scorch. Grab another Scorch there. We'll draw back up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then we'll move back up top to see how the board's changed. With Nyrissia's 3 breach open, we definitely have the potential for some serious damage if my plan comes to fruition. We'll see what happens there. Celidia's 3 breach is also ready to be opened, but I don't know if we're necessarily going to need that. As for the Spawning Horror, it's at 32 health, the breeding chamber is at 3, and we've defeated the only 2 pods that we've faced all game. So we'll bring the turn order deck out. There are also no changes in Nyrissia or Celidia's life totals. Now, how about that Nemesis not starting a round? That would be great. First card from the turn order deck is player 1 for once. Yay, the Nemesis isn't actually starting a round this time. So let's move down to Celidia. We'll start off by sparking the Spawning Horror for 1 to bring him down to 31. And then we've got 2, and Nyrissia can discard a card in hand for a charge, which she will actually, and that'll be her 6th charge, which she'll probably be making use of on her next turn. 3, 4, 5, 6. Which 3 will open her 3 breach. And the other 3 will go to getting her a Reflective Conduit. And I think I want to stack it like that. I'm stacking it off camera for the discard pile. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Taking a quick look at Celidia's hand, we've got some serious firepower coming. Next up for the turn order deck we find player 2. This is going to hurt the Spawning Horror a lot more than it's going to hurt us. So let's go say hello to Nyrissia. Hello, my dear Nyrissia. We'll start off with a spark from her 3 breach, hitting the boss for 2 because of the +1 damage. We'll hit it with the other spark as well to bring the boss down to 28 once this decides to focus. 28. Okay, cool. Now we're going to prep her Scorch to her 3 breach, a Nyrissia's Fury to her 2 breach. Then we're going to discard the crystal to where is it? Dark Blessing to deal 1 damage to the spawning horror. Then we're going to spend her 6 charges to activate Netherlord's Wrath, which will cast a player's prepped spell without discarding it. That spell will deal 1 additional damage. We're going to cast the Scorch to deal 4, +1 for the +1 damage on cast breach is 5, +1 from Netherlord's Wrath is 6, which will bring the spawning horror down to 21. We cast it without discarding it too, which will also return a spell from any player's discard pile, which will be Nyrissia getting a spark back since Celidia just flipped her discard pile. We'll prep the spark to her 1 breach. And then we'll draw back up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Then next up from the turn order deck we'll have the Nemesis. So let's move up to the spawning horror. Nothing happening here, and we may just keep all our damage pointed at the boss. So let's see what happens from the Nemesis deck we find. Brahma Infested. Uh-oh. 10 life. Wait, that shouldn't be in here. Yeah, that shouldn't be in here. So let me get another Nemesis card. I don't know how that ended up being in here. That's for a different Nemesis. Where is... Ah, here you are. Okay, that should be a level 2 card. Okay, here we are. Ah. Alright, so I've got the rest of the level 2 cards right here. We'll shuffle these up. And then that will be our this will be our actual Nemesis card. So here we'll find Dark Bond, to discard to spend 8 ether. Power 2, unleash twice. The player with the lowest life suffers 4 damage, which right now would cut Nyrissia's health in half. That's not hopefully going to be too big of a problem. That's an unleash 2. We may be able to ignore that, especially since we're going to have a lot of damage coming from Nyrissia's next turn. And there's only 1 card left in the turn order, 1 Nemesis card left in the turn order deck, which hopefully... Well, I wouldn't mind it being right now, but let's see what happens here. We find player 2, so let's move down to Nyrissia. We definitely aren't discarding the Dark Bond, and I don't think we're likely to discard it the whole game. But we'll start off with making some damage here. The Spark will hit the Spawning Horror for 1, down to 20. Then Nyrissia's Fury will hit it for another 1, down to 19. She'll get a charge and an ether that we can only use to get a spell. I'll grab a die for that. And then we'll hit the boss for another 5 damage with the Scorch. So that'll bring it down to 14. Then looking at her hand, we'll prep a Spark to her 2 breach. A Voidium Spike for 2. Celidia can discard a card to gain a charge, and she will discard a Spark. Because we've got a lot of spells, so that'll give Celidia her 3rd charge. Then we've got 5 to buy with, which I think will be I think that'll be a Gravity Node. Actually, we've got the 1 that we could use, so 3, 4, 5. We'll use that 5, and then we'll discard this last crystal to Dark Blessing to hit the Spawning Horror for another 1. To bring it down to 13. We'll flip Nyrissia's discard pile over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Interesting. Next card from the turn order deck. Nemesis. So I'll meet you guys back up at the Spawning Horrors play area after I change my battery. Dark Bond will tick down to 1. Next card from the Nemesis deck. Cauterizer, 3 health. When damage is dealt to this minion, reduce that damage to 1. Persistent, any player suffers damage equal to this minion's current life. Yikes. I'll grab a die out for that. Alright, 3 health. And that's it for the Nemesis's turn. Very uneventful. The Breeding Chamber is still at 3 life. And the last card of the turn order deck. Hey, look at that. It's player 1. So let's move down to Celidia. I have done an absolutely terrible job of paying attention to Celidia's Vengeful Shadows. Fortunately, it hasn't mattered for us, but hopefully it won't matter here because we're going to prep a Scorch to her 3 breach, and a to her 2 breach, and a Celidia Spark to her 1 breach, and we're going to discard a Spark to Power Word Silence to shut off the Cauterizer for the Spawning Horrors next turn. So the Persistent won't go off. Then we'll draw back up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll move back up top to see how the board's changed. The Spawning Horror full stop is dead. If we're able to get both actually he's going to be dead this run through the turn order deck anyway. Hopefully the Cauterizer, hopefully the Spawning Horror won't go twice in a row. But we've got more than enough firepower prepped. Actually, do we have enough power prepped? I think we do if we sequence Celidia's next turn properly. Then moving up to the Spawning Horror, it's at 13 health. The Breeding Chamber's at 3. Dark Bond's going to go off and cut Nyrissia's health in half, along with 2 Unleashes. But I don't think the Unleash will be a big problem, as long as the Nemesis doesn't go twice before Nyrissia and Celidia each get a turn. The Cauterizer is out as well. It has 3 health and does damage equal to its health, but it's currently silenced for the next run through the Nemesis, through the turn order deck, or for the next Nemesis turn. So, let's give this a shuffle and see what we can do here. It would be great if we were able to get at least Celidia a turn before the Spawning Horror does its thing. Let's see what happens here. Player 2, not quite as good, but we can probably still work with that. Anyway, let's move down to Nyrissia. I think at this point we just ignore the Cauterizer and race. Actually, we ignore Dark Bond as well. Spark will hit the boss for 2 to bring it down to 11. Then we'll prep Sparks to 3 and 2 breaches. 2 Ether will get Nyrissia a charge, mostly so we can draw a fresh 5. And then we'll discard a Crystal to Dark Blessing to deal 1 damage to the Spawning Horror. That's it for Nyrissia's turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we've got a lot of power here. If this is a Celidia turn, the Spawning Horror is dead, full stop. It's a player 1, so let's move over to Celidia. The one time I remember to pay attention to Vengeful Shadows, it won't even matter, because the Scorch will hit the Scorch from the 3 breach will hit the Spawning Horror for 5 to bring it down to 5. It's hitting for 5 because it's coming off of the 3 breach with +1 damage on cast. Scorch from the 2 breach will hit the Spawning Horror for 4 to bring it down to 1. And then Celidia's Spark would trigger to do 2 additional damage, but the 1 is exactly enough to bring the Spawning Horror down to 0, and we have defeated the Spawning Horror. With that, let's move back up top to wrap this video up. I really enjoy this game of Aeon's End universe. It's ranked very highly in my top 100, in my top 50 board games of all time list last year, And I'm probably getting slightly spoilerific, but I expect it to rank highly again in this year's list when we start in February. As for this playthrough in particular, I never really felt the heat from this one, no pun intended. It helped that we kept the breeding chamber very much under control, so it only spawned 2 ads on us, and one of those came out of the Nemesis deck, where it actually came out very weak, where we were able to take care of it quickly. And then the acidic pod was the only pod that actually spawned from the pod deck, but Nyrissia was able to wipe that out quickly. And as it turned out, I did play that correctly, where when I used the Scorch to defeat the ad, because it came out of the pod deck rather than the Nemesis deck, I didn't give Nyrissia the charges from that. And yes, I did a pretty horrific job of paying attention to Celidia's Vengeful Shadows, but sometimes that's how it goes, and fortunately it didn't end up being relevant to anything. That will do it for this playthrough of Aeon's End. As I'm recording this on Wednesday night, I'm expecting a product unboxing to go up later tonight as well. As for what else is coming up on the channel, Saturday we're continuing Mystical Munchies out of the Cooking with Deadpool cookbook as we make chickarones. Sunday we're continuing the winter campaign in Arkham Horror the card game with the second scenario, The Vanishing of Elena Harper. And next week we're playing an old favorite as we play Expeditions from Stonemaier Games. Thank you for watching the video. Please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to turn on notifications so you get my content. Be well, stay safe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and I'll be back with more videos in the future. Until then, take care everyone.